Have you ever wondered what happens when the very people who coldly threw you away end up on their knees begging you for salvation on national television? They thought a non-disclosure agreement and a few fake tears could bind me, but they had no idea I spent 18 years meticulously building the perfect trap for their greed. Listen closely, because the sweetest revenge of the 21st century does not require violence. It only needs one fatal signature. Hello to the wonderful audience of Vivian Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating. If you find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can pay for their living expenses and continue bringing you the content you love. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment. My name is Delilah Hawkins. I am 28 years old, and I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Nexus. Today, Vanguard Nexus is a self-made venture capital empire, an apex predator currently taking both Silicon Valley and Wall Street by storm. People see the immaculate tailored suits, the sprawling glass corner office overlooking the city skyline, and the ruthless precision with which I dismantle and reconstruct failing corporations. They call me a machine. They whisper that I have ice flowing through my veins instead of blood. But they do not know where that ice was forged. It was not in the cutthroat boardrooms of Manhattan or the high-stakes auction houses of Europe. It was manufactured in the hushed, velvet-lined drawing rooms of Boston's elite. To understand my present, you have to understand the bitter reality of my past. My parents, Arthur and Eleanor Hawkins, were the very epitome of high society pretension. They were creatures obsessed with legacy, pedigree, and the flawless projection of generational wealth. Behind their heavily guarded doors, however, they were drowning. A series of catastrophic investment failures and reckless spending had pushed our family to the absolute edge of hidden bankruptcy. The antique mahogany furniture, the designer charity galas, and the forced smiles were nothing but a fragile, crumbling facade. Desperate to maintain their status, they needed a lifeline. They found their salvation in my twin sister, Serena. From the moment she could type, Serena was heralded as a natural-born technology prodigy. She was the golden child, the chosen one destined to build a billion-dollar startup and pull the Hawkins name from the ashes of their own incompetence. I, on the other hand, was just the spare. I was the quiet observer, the invisible shadow cast by Serena's glaring spotlight. When we were exactly 10 years old, a prestigious, highly exclusive talent incubator academy in Switzerland offered Serena a coveted spot. The annual tuition was astronomical. Arthur and Eleanor simply did not have the liquid funds required to pay for the academy while simultaneously maintaining the extravagant lifestyle required to keep up appearances in Boston. The math did not work in their favor. So, they made a decision. It was not a decision born of explosive domestic rage or drunken violence. There were no bruises, no shattered glass, no screams echoing through the hallways. It was a cold, calculated, administrative adjustment. To cut overhead costs and streamline their remaining assets entirely toward Serena's future, they decided to legally erase me from the family ledger. I will never forget that rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was summoned to the grand formal living room. The air in the room smelled heavily of expensive Earl Grey tea and lemon-scented floor wax. My mother sat on the velvet sofa with her posture perfectly straight, her manicured hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression entirely devoid of maternal warmth. My father stood by the fireplace, adjusting his custom silk tie before he slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany coffee table. It was a formal relinquishment of parental rights. They were voluntarily surrendering me to the state. "Delilah," my mother said, her voice as smooth and emotionless as a porcelain doll, "you have to understand the reality of our situation. This family requires a strong leader to survive the coming years. Serena has the alpha gene. You do not. You are simply a redundant liability, and we can no longer afford to carry dead weight. They did not even offer a fake apology. They handed me over to a deeply uncomfortable social services caseworker, waiting quietly in the marble foyer. It felt exactly as if they were returning a defective luxury handbag to a high-end department store because it did not match their outfit. Of course, the pristine high society of Boston would never accept such a scandalous, grotesque truth. To save face, my parents wove a masterful, tragic fairy tale for the press and their country club friends. They fabricated a heart-wrenching narrative that I was a deeply troubled child afflicted with severe, untreatable psychological issues. They claimed I had violently rebelled and run away in the middle of the night to join a dangerous, obscure cult operating off the grid. Arthur and Eleanor played the roles of the devastated, grieving parents with Oscar-worthy perfection. They soaked up the sympathy, the comforting embraces, and the charitable donations of their wealthy peers. Meanwhile, the child they had just thrown away like yesterday's trash was being tossed into the chaotic, unforgiving, and deeply broken machinery of the foster care system, forced to learn how to survive in a world where the only person you can trust is yourself. The foster care system is a perfectly designed machine for breaking the human spirit. For years, I bounced between sterile group homes and indifferent temporary families, learning early that survival meant silencing my emotions and guarding my intellect. The coldness of society was a bitter daily reality until the day I met Valerie. Valerie was not a traditional foster mother looking for a child to bake cookies with or read bedtime stories to. She was a senior financial analyst for the federal government, a formidable woman whose mind operated entirely on ruthless logic, risk assessment, and market trends. When she formally adopted me, she did not offer me fairy tales or warm hugs. Instead, she handed me thick stacks of corporate balance sheets and taught me how to read the hidden language of money. Valerie forged me into a lone wolf. She taught me that leverage is the only true currency, that sentimentality is the fastest route to bankruptcy, and that you never strike an opponent until you can entirely eradicate their foundation. Armed with her brilliant mentorship, I built Vanguard Nexus from absolute nothing. I started with a single, highly leveraged options trade in a cramped university dormitory room and relentlessly scaled it into a venture capital leviathan that dictated market terms. While I was busy acquiring real assets and quietly accumulating billions, my twin sister was busy acquiring magazine covers. Serena was aggressively marketed by elite public relations firms as the undisputed new tech queen of her generation. She had launched a supposedly revolutionary medical software company that promised to predict cellular mutations with unprecedented accuracy. The mainstream media worshipped her. She wore signature black turtlenecks, gave inspiring keynote speeches at global summits, and proudly rang the opening bell at the stock exchange. However, anyone with a highly trained eye and access to offshore data flows could see the ugly truth. Serena's empire was a spectacular, hollow illusion. Her software was a fundamentally defective failure, and her astronomical corporate valuation was built entirely on a foundation of grossly falsified clinical trial data. She was running a sophisticated, high-tech Ponzi scheme, and the walls were rapidly closing in on her. The collision of our two completely parallel universes was inevitable. It happened when a major national broadcasting network released the primetime promotional trailer for their most prestigious interview program, The Apex Hour. The trailer boldly announced me as their next featured guest, highlighting my rapid ascent and confirming my status as a self-made billionaire. Within 24 hours of that broadcast, the Hawkins family realized the discard they had tossed aside had metamorphosed into a financial titan. Their reaction was as predictable as a declining stock graph. My private office line was suddenly flooded with desperate, emotionally manipulative messages. Arthur, Eleanor, and Serena suddenly wanted to play the roles of a devastated family yearning for a miracle reunion. They claimed they had spent the last 18 years engaged in an exhausting, endless search for me, It was a pathetic, transparent performance, but I decided to play along. I accepted their invitation for a private meeting at an ultra-exclusive, five-star hotel downtown. When I walked into the lavishly decorated private dining suite, the stench of desperation was overwhelming, completely masking the scent of the expensive floral arrangements. Eleanor immediately rushed forward with perfectly timed, dramatic tears streaming down her face, her arms open wide for a motherly embrace. Arthur looked at me with fake, sorrowful pride. Serena sat at the table, forcing a tight, sisterly smile that did not reach her panicked eyes. I smoothly sidestepped my mother's embrace and took a seat at the far end of the long mahogany table. I did not order a drink. I did not exchange pleasantries. I looked directly at Serena and mentally dismantled her. "Let us drop the tedious amateur theater," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "Your medical software startup is bleeding cash at an unsustainable rate. Your lead investors are demanding an audit, the press is circling the rumors, and you are approximately 2 weeks away from a catastrophic public collapse. You did not invite me here to catch up on lost childhood memories. You invited me here because you need Vanguard Nexus to inject $50 million into your holding company to patch the massive fraudulent hole in your balance sheet before the federal regulators notice." The fake smiles instantly evaporated from their faces. Eleanor gasped, her manicured hand flying to her chest. Arthur shifted uncomfortably, his face draining of color. Serena stared at me, her jaw clenched tight as the reality of her exposed failure hung heavily in the air. They were utterly cornered, stripped of their elegant disguises. They knew I held their entire existence in the palm of my hand. For a long moment, the room was completely silent. Then, I leaned back in my chair and offered them a sudden bright smile. "The funny thing is," I continued, watching the desperate hope spark in their greedy eyes, "I am actually perfectly willing to write that check. I will give you the $50 million you need to survive. However, I have one absolute, non-negotiable condition." Arthur leaned forward instantly, the greed practically vibrating off his skin. "Name it, Delilah. Anything you want." "The ink on that investment contract will only dry under the studio lights," I replied, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "We will sign the papers and stage our beautiful, tearful family reunion live on national television. It happens this Friday night, right in the middle of my broadcast on the Apex Hour. You get your money, and the world gets to watch us become a family again." They exchanged quick, victorious glances, completely unaware that they had just sprinted headfirst into a carefully laid trap. The very next morning, the heavy frosted glass doors of my executive suite on the 42nd floor swung open violently. I did not need to look up from my polished mahogany desk to know who had arrogantly bypassed my building security detail. It was Julian, the billionaire fiancé of my sister, a man whose overwhelming arrogance was outmatched only by his complete lack of actual business acumen. He marched into my office flanked by 3 incredibly nervous-looking corporate lawyers who scurried behind him like frightened mice. Julian wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit that screamed desperate intimidation. He marched straight to my workspace and slammed a thick, leather-bound binder onto my desk, disrupting the quiet, controlled hum of the air conditioning. "We are going to make this incredibly simple, Delilah," Julian sneered, leaning his heavy knuckles against the polished wood and attempting to loom over me. "You might think you hold the cards right now because you have the liquid capital, but you are playing in a league you simply do not understand. This document right here is a strictly enforceable, legally binding, non-disclosure agreement." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, casually steepling my fingers together. I did not say a single word, intentionally allowing his fragile, massive ego to nervously fill the silence of the room. "If you even think about asking a single unapproved question regarding the internal financial health of Serena's software company during the broadcast," Julian continued, his voice dropping into a theatrical, highly threatening register, Or if you dare to utter one single word of criticism against Arthur and Eleanor on national television, I will personally see to it that your little venture capital fund is completely buried in a mountain of negative press. I have unlimited resources and I own controlling stakes in half the media outlets on the East Coast. I will fabricate corporate scandals, I will trigger relentless regulatory audits, and I will ensure your institutional investors flee your fund before the markets open on Monday morning. Your entire life's work will be eradicated. He snapped his fingers sharply, and one of his trembling lawyers quickly extracted a single slip of paper from a leather briefcase, placing it perfectly in the center of my desk. It was a certified cashier's check made out directly to me. $5 million, Julian declared, a sickeningly smug grin spreading across his face as he tapped the check. Consider it a highly generous hush fee from your future brother-in-law. You take this money, you sign the investment contract for the $50 million to save the company, and you strictly follow the rules we set. He then pulled out a few sheets of premium stock paper and tossed them aggressively next to the check. It was a pre-written script. I casually picked it up and glanced at the first few paragraphs. It was a nauseating, hyper-emotional monologue, completely designed to whitewash the Hawkins family. It required me to publicly state that my childhood departure was entirely my own rebellious fault, that my parents were flawless saints who never stopped loving me, and that Serena was my ultimate inspiration in the business world. Just as I finished scanning the pathetic script, the office door opened again. Serena strolled in, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and carrying a limited edition handbag that cost more than most people make in a year. She removed her glasses, looking around my pristine office with a barely concealed sneer of pure jealousy. "I see Julian has laid out the terms of your surrender," Serena said, her voice dripping with toxic venom. She walked over and stood right beside Julian, crossing her arms defensively. "Do not let this fancy glass office fool you into thinking you are my equal, Delilah. You might have stumbled into some money by playing the markets, but you fundamentally lack the pedigree and the grace of a true leader. Remember exactly what Mother told you all those years ago in the drawing room? You are still just a redundant child, a spare part that nobody ever truly wanted. Take the $5 million, read the script exactly as it is written, and obediently be a background prop for my success story. Do not try to steal my spotlight. It is the only thing you were ever good for." The room grew incredibly tense. The three lawyers held their breath, likely expecting a massive billionaire ego clash, loud shouting, or building security being called to forcefully remove the intruders. They fully expected explosive rage. They expected me to tear the check into tiny pieces and throw the thick legal binder right in their faces. Instead, I looked at them and let out a soft, completely genuine laugh. I reached into my top desk drawer, pulled out my favorite custom titanium fountain pen, and uncapped it with a smooth, fluid motion. I did not bother reading the dense, restrictive legal jargon of the non-disclosure agreement. I did not even glance at the intricate clauses of the $50 million investment contract Julian had shoved forward. I simply flipped straight to the signature pages of both documents and signed my name with bold, sweeping strokes. "You have my absolute, unbreakable guarantee," I said calmly, carefully capping the pen and pushing the signed documents across the desk toward them. "I promise that during the live broadcast of the Apex Hour, I will not say a single harsh word about you, Serena. Nor will I say anything remotely critical, insulting, or damaging about Arthur and Eleanor. I will be the perfect, supportive, quiet sister you so desperately need." Julian eagerly snatched the documents off the desk, his eyes quickly verifying the fresh ink of my signatures. A loud, triumphant, and deeply arrogant laugh escaped his lips. He looked over at Serena, and they shared a long look of absolute victory. They truly believed that their combined wealth, aggressive tactics, and empty threats had successfully intimidated the rebellious outcast into complete submission. "Smart girl," Julian mocked, turning on his heel to leave. We will see you on Friday night under the studio lights. I watched in total silence as Julian, Serena, and their legal entourage marched proudly out of my office, completely high on their own fabricated superiority. They were so utterly blinded by their perceived victory that they completely failed to notice a crucial, fatal detail. As soon as the heavy doors closed behind them, my executive assistant quietly slipped into the room from the side door and handed me the finalized, legally authenticated carbon copy of the investment contract I had just signed. I looked down at the complex legal clauses printed on the paper, slowly tracing the edge of the document with my index finger, and a slow, incredibly dangerous half-smile spread across my face. The trap was entirely locked, and the prey had just gladly handed me the key. Friday night arrived with the blinding manufactured brilliance of a perfect Hollywood dream. The expansive television studio of the Apex Hour was a masterclass in psychological design, bathed in warm, golden lighting that promised vulnerability and truth. Outside the soundproof walls, an estimated 40 million viewers were tuning in live across the nation, their screens glowing with the intense anticipation of witnessing a modern-day fairy tale. The broadcast network had heavily promoted this exact moment all week, promising a highly emotional, historic reconciliation between a fractured high society family and their lost billionaire daughter. In the center of the stage, arranged carefully on a plush, curved designer sofa, sat the Hawkins family. They were dressed in impeccably tailored, understated luxury garments, carefully chosen to project an image of quiet, dignified suffering. Arthur and Eleanor were giving the performance of a lifetime. Eleanor clutched a silk handkerchief, occasionally dabbing at her dry eyes while looking soulfully into the primary camera. When the host gently inquired about my long absence, Arthur cleared his throat, letting his voice crack with perfectly calibrated sorrow. He spun a beautiful, sickeningly sweet narrative about how they had left the porch light of their Boston estate turned on every single night for 18 years, praying to the heavens for their wayward daughter to finally find her way back home. It was a spectacular display of absolute fiction, and the studio audience swallowed every single word, murmuring in collective sympathy. I sat in the opulent armchair directly opposite them, positioned perfectly under the spotlight. I wore a sharply tailored, pristine white power suit. The color was a very deliberate choice, signaling peace and purity to the audience, while serving as the traditional color of mourning in other parts of the world. I was fully prepared to honor my legal obligations to the absolute letter. I adhered 100% to the strict terms of Julian's non-disclosure agreement. I maintained a warm, gentle smile. My posture was relaxed, and my tone was remarkably soft. When it was my turn to speak, I did not utter a single harsh word. I offered absolutely no personal judgments, no bitter remarks, and no historical criticisms regarding my parents or my sister. Instead, I gave them exactly what they had demanded. I elevated Serena to the status of a living deity. "I have spent years watching my sister from afar," I said smoothly, leaning forward and looking directly into Serena's eyes. "Serena is a visionary. Her medical software company is not just a business venture, it is a profound gift to humanity. She has single-handedly revolutionized the way we approach cellular mutation prediction. The brilliance she brings to the technology sector is unparalleled, and I am endlessly in awe of her unmatched integrity and her innovative spirit. She is the true leader of our generation." Serena visibly preened under the shower of glowing compliments. She sat up straighter, crossing her legs elegantly, her face radiating a smug, arrogant satisfaction that she did not even try to hide from the 40 million people watching. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had successfully weaponized my wealth and forced me to publicly crown her as the superior sibling. Arthur and Eleanor exchanged a quick, subtle nod of profound relief. The storm had passed. The rebellious child had been tamed, and their social standing was completely secure. The atmosphere in the studio was thick with manufactured emotional warmth. The host smiled brightly, preparing to wrap up the segment on a high, triumphant note. That was the precise moment I decided it was time to change the script. Because I believe so deeply in my sister's flawless vision, I continued, my voice echoing clearly through the silent, captivated studio. I wanted to offer more than just empty words of support tonight. Family supports family in tangible ways. I reached inside the inner breast pocket of my white blazer and slowly withdrew the thick, legally binding investment contract. The studio lights caught the heavy parchment paper as I leaned forward and placed it gently onto the transparent glass coffee table separating us. The distinct, sharp sound of the heavy paper hitting the glass echoed through the microphones. "This is a finalized, signed capital injection contract," I announced to the cameras, my smile never wavering. Vanguard Nexus is officially providing Serena's holding company with $50 million in emergency liquid funding to ensure her revolutionary work continues without any financial hurdles. A loud gasp rippled through the live studio audience. The sheer magnitude of the number sent a shockwave through the room. On the sofa, Julian, who was seated in the front row of the audience, beamed with arrogant pride. Serena let out a breath she had clearly been holding, her eyes locked greedily onto the contract resting on the table. "However," I said, my voice suddenly dropping an octave, losing all of its previous artificial warmth and slicing through the celebratory applause like a razor blade. The clapping immediately ceased. The entire studio fell into a dead, heavy silence. "There is a minor administrative detail regarding the structure of my venture capital firm that I must share with the public," I stated clearly, looking directly into the primary broadcast camera. "Vanguard Nexus is not a strictly private entity. We operate with a very unique financial structure. Exactly 40% of our foundational capital is directly sourced from federal government grants and state pension funds. Because we manage public taxpayer money, we are strictly bound by federal oversight laws." I slowly shifted my gaze from the camera back to Serena, whose arrogant smile had suddenly frozen in place. Arthur and Eleanor sat completely motionless, the color rapidly draining from their heavily powdered faces. "According to those strict federal financial regulations," I concluded, every single word landing with the devastating impact of a swinging gavel, "any singular capital disbursement exceeding $10 million automatically, irrevocably, and immediately triggers a comprehensive, publicly accessible federal audit of the receiving company. By accepting this $50 million on live television, Serena, you have just legally authorized the United States government to open every single one of your financial ledgers and clinical trial records by tomorrow morning." The silence in the studio was so absolute that I could hear the frantic, shallow breathing of my mother sitting just 3 feet away from me. The revelation of an automatic federal audit hung in the air like a live grenade. But I had strictly promised to keep my words sweet, and I had every intention of honoring that signed agreement to the absolute letter. I did not hurl angry insults. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse Serena of the financial crimes I already knew she had committed. I merely smiled, maintaining the flawless posture of a deeply supportive sister. "Because this is such a monumental milestone for our family," I said, my voice projecting smoothly into the studio microphones, "and because I want to ensure that this $50 million investment is handled with the utmost care and transparency, I have invited a very special guest to join us on stage tonight. I wanted her here to personally witness this historic moment." The heavy soundproof double doors at the edge of the stage slid open. The massive television studio cameras immediately pivoted, their red recording lights glowing as they captured the entrance. The woman who walked into the blinding glare of the studio lights was not smiling. It was Valerie. However, she was not dressed in the warm, approachable attire one might expect from a loving, sentimental adoptive mother appearing on a daytime talk show. Valerie was clad in a razor-sharp dark navy suit. Pinned securely to her lapel was the unmistakable gleaming gold badge of the United States federal government. She walked with the terrifying, measured authority of an apex predator, and around her neck hung the official credentials identifying her as a senior director of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. She stepped up onto the main platform, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. As she approached the curved designer sofa, Arthur and Eleanor stared at her. At first, their perfectly powdered faces showed only blank confusion. Then, a horrifying realization dawned on my father. His jaw went completely slack, and a thick bead of cold sweat immediately formed at his temple, rolling down his cheek. Eleanor pressed her trembling hands tightly over her mouth, a muffled, strangled gasp escaping her throat. They recognized her. 18 years ago, Valerie was the exact government public servant assigned to process my state relinquishment. She was the woman standing quietly in our marble foyer, the sole external witness to their staggering, calculated cruelty. She knew every single dirty secret they had tried to bury. Valerie did not offer a polite greeting to the host or the audience. She walked directly to the glass coffee table in the center of the stage and slammed a massive 3-inch thick black binder down right next to my pristine investment contract. The impact shook the glass table dangerously. "I understand that your lawyers forced my daughter to sign a highly restrictive non-disclosure agreement," Valerie said, her voice echoing with booming, undeniable authority that commanded the entire room. Fortunately for the American taxpayers, federal agents are not bound by private gag orders when they are conducting an active, ongoing criminal investigation. Serena shrank back into the expensive sofa cushions, her previously arrogant posture completely collapsing. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. She looked exactly like a trapped animal realizing the cage door had just locked shut. "Inside this binder," Valerie continued, tapping the heavy leather cover with a stern index finger, "is the culmination of a 6-month federal probe into your highly celebrated medical software company. We have secured undeniable forensic proof that your predictive cellular technology simply does not exist. Your software is nothing but a hollow, decorative interface. Every single clinical trial result published over the last 3 years has been entirely fabricated. You have actively defrauded your institutional investors, illegally siphoning their capital into offshore shell accounts hidden across 3 different continents. Your company is a textbook. Fraudulent illusion, Serena. It is a criminal enterprise." The live studio audience erupted into a chaotic, deafening symphony of shocked murmurs and loud gasping. The carefully constructed, emotional fairy tale had just violently imploded on live television. Suddenly, a loud, aggressive roar tore through the studio. Julian leaped up from his premium seat in the front row of the audience, his face flushed an angry, volatile red. He stormed toward the edge of the stage, pointing a shaking, furious finger at the host and the camera crew. "Cut the feed right now!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with panic and unhinged rage. "Turn off those cameras immediately! This is a coordinated defamation attack. If you broadcast one more second of this slanderous garbage, I will personally sue this entire television network into absolute bankruptcy. I will bury all of you under a mountain of litigation." The camera operators hesitated for a fraction of a second, their eyes instinctively darting toward the elevated control booth. I remained comfortably seated, perfectly composed, and let out a soft, chilling laugh that was clearly picked up by my microphone. "You cannot sue the network, Julian," I said, my voice slicing effortlessly through his chaotic screaming and forcing him to look at me. "And nobody is cutting the feed. You see, your massive ego made you incredibly careless. You were so entirely focused on intimidating me in my office that you completely failed to monitor the major media acquisition markets. I finalized the total purchase of this television broadcasting network yesterday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I own the cameras. I own the studio. I own the airwaves. And right now, we are broadcasting exactly what I want the world to see." Julian froze dead in his tracks. His mouth opened and closed silently as the devastating reality washed over him. His empty threats were entirely useless. He was a king without a kingdom, standing helplessly in my absolute domain. "Since we are strictly focused on truth and transparency tonight," I continued, turning my attention away from Julian and gesturing gracefully toward the massive LED digital screen spanning the entire back wall of the stage. "Let us finally clear up the heartbreaking tragedy of my sudden childhood departure." The giant screen flared to life. Gone was the warm golden graphic of the show logo. In its place, projected in letters 10 feet high for 40 million viewers to clearly read, were the highly classified state relinquishment documents from 18 years ago. The official paperwork was stark and undeniable. The camera dramatically zoomed in on the designated, legally sworn reason for abandonment. There was no tragic mention of a dangerous cult. There was absolutely no mention of incurable psychological issues or a rebellious runaway child. Instead, printed in cold, bureaucratic black and white, was the singular sentence my parents had submitted under strict penalty of perjury. It read, "Insufficient household funds to support 2 dependents, voluntarily relinquishing the secondary child to redirect all remaining financial assets to the primary beneficiary." Directly below that horrific, soulless sentence were the unmistakable, legally certified signatures of Arthur and Eleanor Hawkins. The studio audience did not murmur this time. They hissed. A collective, heavy wave of pure, unadulterated disgust radiated from the crowd, directed entirely at the 2 people sitting frozen on the stage. The beloved, tragically suffering parents of Boston high society were instantly, permanently unmasked as greedy, callous monsters who had literally thrown their own child away like a defective product to save their bank accounts. The beautiful masks were completely shattered into a million pieces, and the entire world was finally watching the ugly, rotting truth underneath. The heavy silence following the revelation on the giant screen was suddenly shattered by a sound I never thought I would hear. It was a visceral, agonizing shriek from Serena. The flawless, confident tech queen image violently disintegrated in front of 40 million viewers. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the expensive studio rug, clutching her perfectly styled hair in absolute panic. "It was them!" Serena screamed, her voice tearing through the studio, her shaking finger aimed directly at Arthur and Eleanor. "They made me do it. I never wanted to be a chief executive officer. I did not even write the original software code. They hired ghost developers and forced me to memorize the technical jargon. When the money ran out 3 years ago, they told me to fake the clinical trials, or we would lose the estate and the country club memberships. They pushed me into this fraud to keep their wealthy illusion alive." Arthur scrambled backward on the sofa, his face a mask of sheer terror as his golden child publicly threw him to the wolves. The studio audience gasped loudly, capturing every pathetic, rotten detail of the Hawkins family dynamic. The illusion of their generational wealth was finally exposed as nothing but a parasitic infection feeding on lies. Julian stepped forward, his face pale and covered in a cold sweat. "This does not matter," Julian stammered, pointing frantically at the legal document resting on the glass table. "You signed the capital injection contract. $50 million is coming into the holding company by tomorrow morning. We have the money now. We can pay the federal fines. We can settle this out of court." I stood up slowly from my chair, casually smoothing the front of my white power suit. "Julian," I said softly, looking at him with absolute, icy pity, "did you honestly believe a venture capital firm like Vanguard Nexus reached the apex of Wall Street by blindly handing over $50 million to a failing startup without reading the fine print? You were so incredibly eager to force me into signing that non-disclosure agreement, so obsessed with your little $5 million hush money stunt, that you completely neglected to have your highly paid lawyers review the actual financial document I signed." I picked up the heavy parchment paper from the glass table and held it up to the blinding studio lights. "This is not a capital injection contract," I announced, ensuring every single word was crystal clear for the microphones. This is a comprehensive debt acquisition and total asset forfeiture agreement. By bringing this document into my office and accepting my signature, you legally authorized Vanguard Nexus to consolidate and purchase every single outstanding debt your companies currently hold. In exchange for absorbing those massive liabilities, this contract instantly transfers 100% of your corporate equity, all intellectual property, and every single piece of collateralized personal property directly to my firm. The Boston estate, the luxury vehicles, the offshore bank accounts, everything you own is now the legal property of Vanguard Nexus. You are completely bankrupt. Julian's knees buckled. He stumbled backward, catching himself on the edge of the stage, his eyes wide with unadulterated horror. He had gladly handed me the keys to his entire kingdom simply because his arrogance prevented him from reading the text. Before anyone could utter another word, the side doors of the television studio burst open. The blinding flashbulbs of the press erupted like a violent lightning storm. A dozen federal agents, wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow letters across the back, marched down the side aisles with terrifying, synchronized precision. They did not care about the live broadcast. They moved directly onto the stage, completely surrounding the sofa. "Arthur Hawkins and Serena Hawkins," the lead agent barked, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive securities fraud, and severe violations of federal banking regulations. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The studio devolved into absolute, unprecedented chaos. Serena thrashed wildly, screaming hysterically as the cold steel snapped securely around her wrists. Arthur offered no physical resistance. He simply stared blankly ahead, a completely broken man, as two armed agents hoisted him roughly to his feet. The flashing cameras immortalized their spectacular downfall, capturing the exact moment the untouchable Boston elite were reduced to common criminals on national television. Amidst the screaming and the flashing lights, I felt a desperate, weak tug on the hem of my white trousers. I looked down. Eleanor was on her knees, the expensive silk of her designer dress pooled around her on the floor. Her flawless makeup was entirely ruined by thick black tears, her face twisted in an ugly mask of sheer desperation. "Delilah, please," Eleanor sobbed, her voice cracking as she clawed weakly at my leg. "Please, I am your mother. You cannot let them do this to us. You have the money. You have the power. Save us, please." I looked down at the woman who had coldly signed me away 18 years ago to save her own lavish lifestyle. I searched my heart, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger, no sadness, and no lingering childhood trauma. I just felt completely, undeniably free. I gently but firmly reached down and brushed her trembling hands off my clothing. "You were right all those years ago in the drawing room, Eleanor," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the heavy, final weight of a dropping gavel. "I do not have the gene of a leader. I have the gene of a judge." I turned my back on her weeping form. Valerie stepped forward, a proud, unwavering smile on her face, and linked her arm firmly through mine. Together, my true mother and I walked away from the wreckage. We stepped down from the stage, navigating effortlessly through the sea of flashing cameras, stunned reporters, and the chaotic, echoing screams of the Hawkins family. We walked straight toward the brightly lit exit signs at the back of the studio, leaving behind a ruined dynasty that had eagerly dug its own grave out of pure greed. The air outside the studio was crisp and cool, tasting entirely of absolute freedom and the quiet, unshakable strength of an empire that could never be overthrown. Thank you so much to our wonderful audience for listening to this story today. Where are you currently tuning in from? If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping us with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by using the PayPal link located in the description or the pinned comment section. Your generous support allows our channel to pay our hardworking staff, helping them feed their families and empowering us to continue creating even better stories for you in the future.